The rain was falling heavily, pounding against the Whitmore house's glass windows as if it were a punishment. Margaret Whitmore stood by the window, staring out, but her eyes did not see the storm. Her mind was elsewhere, far away, in a memory that still haunted her, one she tried to erase as if it were possible. The image of her young children, Theodore and Benjamin, her dark-skinned twins, was still fresh in her mind. It was impossible to forget. From the day they were born, with dark skin, she knew something was wrong. Her husband, Charles, had been clear, never hiding who he was or where he came from. But Margaret had the perfect American life. Everyone expected from her, the kind of life that neighbors looked at with admiration, and she never dreamed that one day the image of her family would be tarnished. The twins were the surprise of her life, a surprise she never asked for. Theodore, the older one by just a few minutes, and Benjamin, with his charming smile, but so deeply different from what she had imagined. They were her shame, the shame she tried to hide, but it only grew as time passed. That day, when the boys were still small, she remembered clearly the moment she tried to change things. Frustration filled her eyes as she watched the dark spots on Theodore's skin, the skin that made him look like his father, a black man. She remembered how hatred and anger took over her chest in that instant. It wasn't what she had planned. It wasn't what she wanted for her family. But what could she do? There was no turning back. There was only one thing to do. The pain of seeing the boys grow with Charles's appearance, of having to deal with the looks others gave them, was becoming unbearable. She could no longer bear the thought of being seen as the mother of those children. It wasn't what society expected from a woman like her. She needed to do something, and she would do whatever it took. So she began. Margaret didn't talk to anyone, didn't ask for help. But she knew no one would understand. What she was doing was something no one would ever imagine. She started with small steps. To her, every gesture, every method she used was justified. What she was doing was for them, so they could be accepted, so she could be accepted, so her life could be normal again. But over the years, things only got worse. Theodore and Benjamin were no longer innocent little children who didn't even understand what was happening around them. They began to notice the changes in their mother's behavior. Something was wrong, but still too young to understand what was going on in Margaret's mind. They began to distance themselves, sensing that the love she offered was not the love they needed. The tension in the Whitmore household grew. Margaret knew she could no longer hide for much longer. Theodore and Benjamin were starting to ask questions, starting to question their own identities. But what could she say? How could she explain the inexplicable? And it was in that moment that, for the first time, fate forced them to face what was really happening. When she least expected it, a revelation would change everything. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside Margaret's house, the silence was palpable. What would be more difficult, revealing the truth or continuing to hide it? The Whitmore house, once filled with laughter and memories, was now immersed in an almost unbearable silence. Theodore and Benjamin were already teenagers, and with age came the questions Margaret had feared. They began to notice the differences, to question their mother's constant changes in attitude, the way she treated them distantly, almost coldly, while love and affection seemed to slip through her fingers. The boys were smart, much smarter than Margaret had ever imagined. They knew something was wrong, and they were determined to figure out what it was. Like any growing child, they began to understand the subtleties of their own identities. But the answers they sought were far beyond what they had imagined. At first, they thought Margaret's behavior was due to something temporary, a phase of nervousness or stress. Maybe it was Charles's job, the pressures of everyday life, or something else she tried to justify. But it didn't take long for them to realize that this was not a phase. It was a constant. And the most troubling part, it seemed directly related to them, to both of them, Theodore and Benjamin. The first sign came when the boys noticed the tone of Margaret's voice when she spoke to them, as if she were holding back from shouting. She began to get irritated over the smallest things, as if their presence was unbearable. It was Benjamin, always more observant, who realized the connection between her behavior and their physical features. The dark skin, the curly hair, the brown eyes. Every feature of theirs seemed like a silent accusation to Margaret. Then, something happened. Theodore, with his curious and determined nature, began to ask questions. Simple questions at first. Why do people look at us differently, Mom? Why is my hair so different from yours? And finally, why do you seem to avoid looking at us? Margaret tried to hide the pain in her eyes, but Theodore knew something was wrong. The worst part was that he didn't know exactly what was wrong. He just felt that the love he and Benjamin were receiving wasn't the love a mother should give her children. It was when, on a rainy afternoon like any other, Theodore found a box hidden in a closet in the attic. The box was covered in dust, as if it had been there for years, forgotten. Inside it were documents, old photos and letters, but what really caught his attention were the bottles of creams and ointments. Bottles that seemed to have been used recently, with faded labels, but still legible. The name of a product that, although strange, seemed familiar to him. Something related to skin whitening. With his heart pounding, Theodore rummaged through the box, finding more clues. The documents weren't just old family photos. There were also medical records, personal notes from his mother, and among it all, diary. A diary that he hesitated over for a few seconds, but couldn't resist. When he opened it, he saw the words written hastily, as if his mother had tried to hide her emotions. She described the disgust, the shame she felt when looking at her children, and how she felt incapable of dealing with the reality of having them. There were references to her husband, Charles, and how much she feared society would see her children as a threat to the status and image of her family. The shock was like a blow. Theodore couldn't believe what he was reading. His mother, the woman who had always tried to protect them from the world, was the same one who, in her tortured mind, thought the only solution was to erase their identity, to erase the part of them that bothered her, the part of them that was more like the man she had never accepted loving. Benjamin, who also started his own investigations, quickly discovered the truth for himself. When the two brothers met, Theodore's eyes were filled with tears, but he could no longer hide what he had discovered. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. But what to do with this truth? How to face the woman who, until that moment, had been their mother, but who now seemed like a stranger? Theodore and Benjamin knew they needed to confront Margaret. They needed to understand why this had happened. They needed, at the very least, to know what motivated her actions. Margaret, for her part, was beginning to realize that her children were distant, quieter, and more suspicious than ever. She knew time was running out, but she didn't know how to deal with it, how to fix the mistake she had made without realizing she was digging a chasm between them. The tension in the house was palpable. When the boys finally decided to talk to her, the atmosphere was already filled with honest questions and raw emotions. The confrontation was imminent. Night fell with tense calm, and the Whitmores seemed like any other ordinary family to an outsider. But inside that house, the weight of Theodore and Benjamin's discoveries hung in the air, as if they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Pain and confusion consumed them. The feeling of betrayal was unbearable, and both knew they could no longer ignore what they knew. The next morning, Theodore got up earlier than usual. He could no longer sleep. His heart was tight, and his mind, in tatters, was still processing the revelation he saw in those papers. He knew that from now on, nothing would be the same. The weight of the truth he carried was too heavy to be ignored. He needed to confront his mother, and he knew that Benjamin, though shaken, was in the same situation. They could no longer live in a house where lies hovered over them like a shadow. Benjamin was in the kitchen, disinterestedly stirring his pancakes. He didn't seem very willing to talk, but when he saw Theodore walk in, he looked up and, with a tired sigh, said, "We have to talk to her, don't we?" Theodore didn't respond immediately. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready for it. How could one prepare for a confrontation like this? How could one face the woman who had fed you, who should have been your source of love, but who, in reality, was there to distort your own identity? "We don't have a choice, Ben. We can't hide what we know anymore. She needs to know we know," Theodore replied, his voice firm, but trembling with emotion. "And what will we do afterward? How will this change things?" Benjamin asked, not looking directly at his brother. He seemed more concerned about the consequences of a possible fight, of an irreversible misunderstanding, because he knew Margaret's reaction wouldn't be gentle. They both stayed silent for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what was about to happen. Theodore felt a lump in his throat. He never imagined that something like this could happen in his family. Everything they had known until then seemed like a lie. Margaret, who had always been proud of her appearance and the perfection of their family, now seemed like a stranger, someone he barely recognized. It was hard to believe that everything she had done to him and Benjamin, all the efforts to change their appearances, had been because of a prejudice she carried, something that came from deep within her. It's going to be difficult, but we have to move on, Theodore concluded, already knowing what he would do. They needed to face reality head-on. However, deep down, both knew that the words they would speak would never be enough to erase the pain of all the manipulation, all the emotional coldness they had endured for years. Something inside them was already broken. But the truth, as painful as it was the only thing that could start the healing process. When Margaret appeared in the kitchen later, her hair perfectly styled and the look of someone about to spend the day solving yet another of the 1,000 problems in her perfect world, Theodore and Benjamin exchanged glances, as if they knew this would be the crucial moment, the moment when everything would change forever. Margaret smiled with an air of superiority, as if nothing were out of place, but the boys were watching her, and the difference between what she represented and what they knew now seemed colossal. "Good morning, boys," Margaret said in a sweeter voice than usual, as if trying to disguise the tension in the air. Benjamin was the first to speak, and his voice came out harsher than he expected. "Mom, we know," he said, with a serenity that contrasted with the whirlwind of emotions flooding him. "We know what you did." Margaret stopped, and her smile faltered for a moment before she tried to maintain her composure. "What are you talking about?" She tried to deflect, but the boys weren't going to let her. Theodore stepped forward, looking directly into his mother's eyes, now without fear. His voice was filled with pain, but also with a determination he didn't know he had. "We know about the creams, the treatments. We know what you tried to do to us, Mom. You can't hide it anymore. We know." Margaret's expression changed. For the first time in years, her eyes showed something other than the tight control she usually maintained. There was a flicker of fear, and maybe even shame, but she quickly regained her composure, and, with an unsettling calm, replied, "What do you think you know, Theodore?" "Benjamin, I don't know what you're talking about. I always wanted the best for you." But the boys were beyond empty words. The truth was right there, raw and exposed. Theodore spoke directly. "You did this because you couldn't accept us the way we are. You couldn't accept our skin. You never accepted Dad. You did all this out of shame for us, Mom. And that can't be fixed." Margaret looked at the two of them, her eyes watering, and for a moment, she seemed vulnerable, but she quickly stood up, her defensiveness taking over. "No, you don't understand," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I just wanted things to be different. I wanted the world to look at us differently. I just wanted your lives to be better." But her words didn't have the impact she expected. The lie no longer protected her. Theodore and Benjamin were seeing the woman she truly was, and it was more than they could bear. At that moment, everything seemed to be falling apart. There was no more room for excuses. There were no more excuses for the years of rejection disguised as protection. The boys were facing a truth that would change their lives forever. The weight of the silence following Theodore and Benjamin's words seemed to consume everyone in the room. Margaret stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the ground as if trying to gather the strength to face the storm that had formed around her. But there was no escaping anymore. The confrontation had been made, and now she could no longer deny what she had done. Benjamin, still in shock from his mother's reaction, looked at Theodore. Both of them felt a lump in their throats, but something within them was also changing. It was no longer about the pain of being rejected by a mother, but about the need to understand the origin of that pain, to figure out why Margaret had acted that way. It was as if the veil that had covered reality had ripped open, revealing an abyss of suffering, fear, and shame, but also an opportunity to finally understand what had marked them their entire lives. "What happened to you, Mom?" Theodore asked, with a calmness he didn't know he had. "How could you do this to us?" Margaret looked at him, but instead of answering, a tear fell down her face. She seemed to crumble inside, and for a brief moment, Theodore had the impression she might finally tell the truth. But she pulled herself together, wiped her face, and tried to keep up the facade. I just wanted to protect you," she said, her voice wavering, trying to justify her actions as if she truly believed that was the truth. "The world is cruel. You don't know what it's like to be different, to suffer every day for something you can't control. I wanted you to have a better life, without the stares, without the prejudice." Benjamin shook his head, frustration rising within him. He couldn't believe her words anymore. This wasn't protection. It was an act of denial, a desperate attempt to escape her reality she didn't know how to deal with. "But this isn't protection, Mom. This is manipulation. You made us believe we were defective just because of our skin," Benjamin said, his voice now more firm. "We can't live with this anymore. We can't pretend everything is fine." Margaret looked at both of them with a lost expression, as if she were seeing them for the first time. The weight of guilt now seemed to crush her, but she didn't know how to handle it. She, who had always controlled every aspect of her life and her children's lives, now found herself facing something she couldn't control, the face of truth, staring back from the eyes of her own children. I didn't know what to do," she murmured finally, her voice broken. "I just wanted you to be accepted. I didn't want you to go through what I went through." Margaret's confession brought a heavy silence, but deep down, Theodore and Benjamin knew those words were not enough to erase what had been done. The past was an abyss now before them, and nothing could take away the weight of what Margaret had tried to hide. It wasn't just about lightening their skin, it was about what that meant: a desire to erase the heritage of her own husband, the denial of her children's identity, the attempt to control the uncontrollable. But as Margaret spoke, a greater truth began to emerge within the boys. She was so immersed in her own insecurities and distorted beliefs that she couldn't see how much she was damaging her children. She wanted so badly to change reality, to please a world that would never accept those she loved, that she ended up losing sight of them. Theodore and Benjamin didn't know if this made them feel angry or sorry for her, but the fact was, at that moment, nothing would ever be the same again. "Mom, we want to understand you. But you need to be honest with us. You need to tell us what really happened. What's behind this decision?" Theodore said, with a bitter calm. He felt the weight of his words, but he knew he couldn't go on without knowing the full truth. Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words, but finally, her expression changed, and she sat down on the sofa as if the burden of guilt was about to consume her entirely. I never could accept what you, Theodore and Benjamin, represented to the rest of the world," she said, with an unsettling sincerity. "Your father, when he came into my life, I thought I could ignore the differences. But deep down, I always knew he was a reflection of a society that would never accept us. And when you two were born, saw everything. I feared that people would look at you and see only the color of your skin, without seeing how smart you were, how much you had to offer." The air in the room seemed dense, as if every word Margaret spoke added more weight to Theodore and Benjamin's shoulders. The truth was there, but the path to healing still seemed very distant. They had the answer they had been looking for, but it didn't make them feel relief. The pain was too deep for a mother's words, no matter how sincere. To erase it, she still had the stains on her fingers from trying to mold her children to her liking, to the liking of a world that refused to look beyond the color of their skin. Benjamin was the first to speak again, his voice firm but tinged with exhaustion. "So, what do you want now, Mom? Do you want us to forgive you? Do you want everything to go back to normal? Because nothing will go back. Nothing will be the same again." The silence that followed was thick and painful. Margaret didn't know what to say. She looked at her children, a mix of sadness and regret in her eyes, but there were no words that could make it go away. The air in the room seemed to thicken with each passing second, as if time was dragging, unsure of how to act in the face of the devastation caused by the truth. Margaret was there, before her children, and nothing she said could erase the mark of shame she carried. She tried to hold her gaze steady, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying what she wanted to hide. Fear. Fear of abandonment, of despair, and above all, losing control. Benjamin stepped away from Theodore, walking toward the window, looking out at the garden behind the house. The sun was low, beginning to set, and the shadows were starting to creep over the yard. He felt an urgent need to distance himself, to breathe, to find a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. Theodore, on the other hand, couldn't stop staring at his mother. Each of her words seemed to penetrate deeper into his chest, as if he could physically feel the weight of the lies he'd been told his whole life. "Mom, this isn't going to disappear," Theodore said, breaking the silence, his voice heavy with the weariness he couldn't hide. "The things you've done to us, you can't just ignore that. You can't pretend everything is fine." Margaret sighed deeply, and the pain in her eyes was undeniable. She looked like a broken woman, as if her entire facade had been destroyed in front of those eyes that looked at her with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. But it was no longer about what she felt. It was about what her children felt, and that, she knew, was irreparable. Benjamin turned back around, his expression hard, his eyes now fixed on his mother with an intensity he didn't even know where it came from. He felt a silent anger building inside him, not only because of everything she had done, but because of the way she had tried to justify her actions. It wasn't just about lightening her skin. It was about everything she had denied, about the way she had tried to shape their lives according to her own insecurities. "You tried to destroy our identity, Mom. Tried to erase everything we are," Benjamin said, his voice tense. "And now you want us to just forgive you? How do you expect us to live with that?" Margaret's reaction was silent, but visible. She lowered her head, tears falling once again, as if she had surrendered completely. There were no more words for her. The emptiness inside her suffocated her, and the love she had always tried to control turned into an irreparable pain. But while all of this was happening, the two brothers were beginning to understand something they hadn't seen before. Their pain was deep, yes, but Margaret's pain seemed even more terrifying. The guilt and regret she now carried seemed to be the greatest enemies of all. And then, in the heavy silence of the room, Theodore made a decision. He knew that the path to healing wouldn't come from a simple apology or a hollow gesture. More than that was needed. It was necessary to face what had happened once, and for all and perhaps begin to rebuild what had been destroyed. "Mom, we're not asking you to change or to make everything go back to the way it was," Theodore said, his voice calm but full of a firmness he never knew he had. "We just want you to understand what you've done, and we want you to help us find a way to ourselves. Because, up until now, you've taught us to live a lie." Benjamin looked at his brother. Feeling the weight of Theodore's words, he knew this was the beginning of a journey that could be long, perhaps painful, but it was also the only way forward. The path of truth, of facing things, of reconciliation. Not with their mother, but with themselves, with the identity Margaret had tried to erase. They would rebuild whatever they could, but first, they needed to understand that in order to do so, they had to look ahead, not back. Margaret, with her hands over her eyes, finally stood up from the couch. It was as if she had heard the words that needed to be said, but that she never wanted to hear. She knew she was lost in a sea of regret, but the only thing she could do now was try to take a step, even a small one, in the direction of what was real. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice hoarse, still not believing. She had come to this point. She no longer knew what remained of her beliefs, her identity. She just wanted it all to disappear. The silence hung again, but this time, it wasn't a silence of disconnection. It was a silence that made room for something new, something Theodore and Benjamin were ready to face. No matter how hard it was, no matter how long the road to healing would be. They knew they had started the journey, and it was far from easy, but it had to be faced. And then, looking at his mother one last time, Benjamin took a step toward the door. "I don't know what you're going to do now, Mom, but we need some time. Maybe one day we can find a way to move forward," he said, his voice firm, but with an underlying pain. The door closed behind Benjamin, and Theodore stood there for a few more moments, watching Margaret, who was now alone in her own pain, with no more words to offer. The truth had been spoken, and now, they all had to live with the consequences. But what would come next? How could they start over after all of this? The air seemed thicker with each passing second. The house, usually full of life, now seemed like an empty, suffocating place. The walls, silent witnesses to a story of pain and frustration, held secrets that could never be forgotten. Theodore and Benjamin were at a breaking point. Torn between the desire to start over and the need to deal with the consequences of a past that stretched like a dark shadow over them. Margaret sat on the couch, her mind spinning non-stop. Every thought was a sharp knife, piercing her conscience. The heavy silence that had formed after her children's words hit her harder than any scream could have. She saw herself alone, as never before, facing what she had done to those who were her flesh and blood. But more than the guilt, what hurt the most was the realization that her children were far from everything she had imagined they would be, and she knew now that her struggle to change their reality had been in vain. Benjamin was outside, aimlessly walking through the garden, feeling the warm evening wind against his face. He felt a mix of anger and sadness, but there was something else inside him, something he didn't know how to describe. The sense of loss was deep, but the sense of freedom, of finally seeing the truth, was also beginning to emerge. He had freed himself from the weight of the lies his mother had created. But what to do with that freedom now? Why did the truth seem, somehow, harder to carry than the lies? His steps were long, but uneven, as if the weight of his own history still made him falter. He didn't know what would happen next, nor what he could say to Theodore, to his mother, or to himself. What he knew was that nothing would be the same as before. There was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain. Inside the house, Theodore remained still, watching Margaret. He felt the growing discomfort in his chest, as if being there, facing the woman who had given birth to him, was more of a torture than a need for resolution. The pain didn't have a precise shape, but he knew the experience, however painful, was leading somewhere, to some form of understanding. "Theodore, are you okay?" Margaret's voice was soft, almost a whisper. She didn't know how to approach him, didn't know how to apologize for everything she had done. She had never really known how to communicate with her children. She had spent her life trying to control them. But now, in the face of the truth, the need to be understood seemed greater than any pride she had left. He looked at her, and for a moment, the anger he felt was replaced by something different: pity. He didn't know what to do with that feeling, but it was there. He had arrived at this point without wanting to, but now, he knew he couldn't go back. He would have to move forward, not just for himself, but for Benjamin. "Do you want us to go on as before?" Theodore asked, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was cold, but there was a clarity she had never seen before. "Do you want us to pretend nothing happened? That you didn't do what you did to us? How can you expect us to be a family again after all of this?" Margaret bit her lip, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions that overwhelmed her. She knew words weren't enough, but at the same time, words were all she had left. And those words, in that moment, seemed so small in the face of everything she had destroyed. She began, but the sentence died before she could finish. She didn't know what to say, how to start. Maybe because there wasn't a starting point. Maybe because, deep down, she knew that words could never fix what had been done. Benjamin returned to the house shortly after, his steps firmer now, as if something inside him had been resolved, even if just a little. He didn't look at his mother but did at Theodore, who was watching him closely. "I don't know what to do with this, Theo," Benjamin said, his voice trembling, but with a little more calm. "I don't know how to deal with all of this, but maybe it's time to figure out what we're going to do now. I don't know if we can go back, and I don't know if we can forgive her, but we have to move forward." Theodore looked at his brother, and for a moment, Benjamin's sadness was reflected in him. Their sadness now seemed to merge at a single point, as if each of their hearts had been cut in half. But it was all that was left. Moving forward. The pain was real, and the truth, at last, was clear. Margaret watched the two boys, the children she had tried to shape in her image. She knew that the path to redemption didn't pass through her, but through them. They had to find their own way, far from her distorted beliefs. I understand. Margaret's voice was softer now, filled with resignation. I just hope that, one day, you can forgive me. Not for me, but for you. I've hurt you in ways I can never fix, but I hope you find a way to heal. Benjamin took a step toward the door without looking back. He knew that, no matter how much he wished, forgiveness didn't come overnight. Not for Margaret, but he also knew he couldn't let himself be consumed by it. Theodore followed him, and together, they crossed the threshold, leaving Margaret alone in a house that would never be the same. The silence in the house was oppressive. The boys' footsteps echoed through the house, and Margaret stood there, in the place where she had so often tried to control their lives. Now, she knew she had lost the battle. The following days were like a series of slow, painful movements. Theodore and Benjamin were out of the house. That place, once the home where they grew up, now felt like a prison of memories and disappointments. They met many times in cafes, in public places where no one knew who they were. The world outside seemed distant, but at the same time, it was the only place where they could still breathe, no longer under the weight of a lie that had marked their lives. The mornings were filled with long conversations, and the afternoons dragged on with the sound of both of them trying to find a way to rebuild everything that had been broken. They were just trying to understand who they were now. After all, the truth had been exposed. Time, however, had the power to heal, even if slowly. But it also had the power to make people realize that what hurts the most are not the scars life leaves, but what they can still become. Time passed, and a certain calm began to settle into Theodore and Benjamin's lives, but something was still missing, something unresolved. The wound Margaret had left in their souls still needed healing. They both knew it. A month later, Theodore decided it was time to confront their mother again. He felt that without this step, the scar would never fully close. Benjamin, though he knew forgiveness was difficult, also understood that it was part of a journey that could no longer be postponed. Margaret, for her part, was in her house, still immersed in the loneliness she had created herself. She had lost the family she had tried so hard to control, but at the same time, she knew she had no right to ask for anything back. She was aware of the pain she had caused, and the weight of it seemed greater than she could carry. Even so, a part of her soul longed for some kind of resolution. Something that would give her a reason to believe there was still something good in her, that she was not just a monster. It was on a rainy morning that Theodore and Benjamin appeared at her door. Margaret, sitting in the rocking chair, stared at the two boys, who, in some way, were the same, yet completely different. She didn't know how to approach them, or what to say, but she knew this moment was inevitable. Without saying a word, Theodore entered the house and sat on the sofa. Benjamin did the same. The tension in the air was palpable, but something new was happening. What was once a confrontation now felt like a silent conversation. Almost like an exchange of glances between two worlds that still needed to find a way to coexist. "How are you?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling, as if she were afraid of the answer. She didn't know if she would be able to bear another rejection. "We're trying to understand, Mom," Theodore finally spoke. His voice not angry, but with deep sadness. He wasn't accusing anymore, but trying to accept, trying to make sense of what seemed senseless. "I know what I did. I know there are no words that can fix this." Margaret swallowed hard. "But please know that I never meant to cause this kind of pain. I was lost. You have no idea how much this weighs on me." Benjamin stayed silent, but his gaze said it all. He had no words, but in some way, he was willing to listen. Theodore, on the other hand, no longer wanted to stay trapped in the past. He knew the pain could never be erased, but perhaps it was time to take a step toward the future. "We can't go back, Mom," Theodore said calmly. "What happened, happened. But maybe we can start again. Not as a family, maybe, but as people. I don't know what this means for you, but for me, it's what's left. A new beginning, with the truth. No more lies. I don't know what forgiveness is. I don't know if I can forgive you. But I know I can't continue with this weight on me." Benjamin nodded, then finally spoke. his voice softer than he had expected. What happened, Mom? It doesn't have an explanation. Maybe we can move forward, but that depends on you, because we've already decided who we want to be, with or without you. But what you did, the choice you made for us, can't be erased. Not by you, and not by us. But who knows? Maybe one day, after a long time, forgiveness could be part of all this. Margaret felt something inside her break. It wasn't a superficial regret. It was a visceral pain. A pain that came from the awareness that, even trying to fix it, she had destroyed the most valuable thing she had, her relationship with her children. And maybe that was what she needed to face now. Not immediate forgiveness, but the understanding that rebuilding would come, if possible, with time. She stood up, finally, and went to the window, looking out at the gray sky, where the rain had started to subside. When she returned, her eyes were lighter, and something in the air seemed to have changed. Something that might be the first sign of a possible reconciliation, but that didn't mean everything was resolved. I love you both, I always have. But I don't know what will become of us, Margaret whispered, her voice broken. I just hope that, somehow, you can live your lives the best way possible, and maybe, one day, we can meet again. Silence. It was the end of one cycle, the beginning of another. The door was open. What would happen next? They couldn't predict, but what remained now was each one's individual journey. Theodore and Benjamin left the house, and this time, unlike the last, there was no weight, but a lightness. They were free on some level to move forward.